My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old now. Though sometimes I feel like I've lived several lifetimes already, they said it was discipline. I called it survival. The words echo in my mind as I sit here in my small apartment, finally safe enough to tell this story, finally far enough away from the house on Maple Street where my childhood died a slow, methodical death. It started when I was 7. That's when my father decided that his military training wasn't just something he'd left behind in Afghanistan, it was something he'd bring home, something he'd use to mold his only daughter into what he called a proper soldier. My mother had died in a car accident the year before, and I think something in him broke that day. Not the grief kind of broken that people understand and sympathize with, but the dangerous kind that twists love into something unrecognizable. The first time he made me stand at attention for 2 hours straight because I'd left my backpack on the kitchen counter instead of hanging it in the designated spot by the door. I thought it was just Dad being sad and strange. My legs shook by the end, and when I finally collapsed, he looked down at me with disappointment. So heavy it felt like a physical weight on my chest. "Discipline builds character, Sarah," he said, his voice measured and cold. "Your mother was too soft on you. I won't make that mistake." I didn't understand then that this was just the beginning. I didn't know that the man who used to read me bedtime stories and make pancakes shaped like butterflies on Sunday mornings was disappearing, replaced by someone who saw weakness in every childhood impulse, every moment of joy, every sign that I was still just a little girl who missed her mother. The rules came next. Lists of them, typed and laminated, posted throughout the house. Wake up at 0500 hours. Make bed with hospital corners. Brush teeth for exactly 2 minutes. Breakfast consumed. In silence, finished within 15 minutes. No singing, no humming, no unnecessary noise. Posture must be maintained at all times. Shoulders back, spine straight, eyes forward. Toys were removed from my room one by one until only the essentials remained. A single pillow. Sheets, school clothes arranged with military precision. I learned to move through the house like a ghost, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floors, my breathing shallow and controlled. The house itself seemed to change around us, becoming something cold and institutional. Family photos disappeared. My mother's things vanished from their bedroom. Even the bright yellow curtains she'd loved were replaced with plain white blinds that let in harsh, unforgiving light. School became my refuge, though I couldn't tell anyone what home was like. How do you explain to a teacher that your father times your homework sessions and makes you do push-ups if you take too long? How do you tell your friends that you can't come to their birthday parties because social events are frivolous distractions from personal development? I became an expert at crafting excuses, at smiling when inside I felt like I was slowly disappearing. The physical training started when I turned 8. Every morning before school, after my regulated breakfast, I had to complete what he called PT, push-ups, sit-ups, running laps around our backyard while he timed me with his old military stopwatch. If I didn't meet his arbitrary standards, I'd have to repeat everything until I did. I was 8 years old, barely 4 feet tall, and he was pushing me like I was a recruit at boot camp. "Pain is weakness leading the body," he'd say as I struggled. "Through exercises designed for grown men. You'll thank me for this someday, Sarah. When life gets hard, you'll have the discipline to handle it." But life was already hard. It was hard every morning when I woke up to his sharp whistle instead of gentle nudging. It was hard sitting through classes while my muscles ached from morning PT. It was hard watching other kids laugh and play while I stood at attention during recess. Practicing the military bearing he insisted I maintain even at school, the isolation, was perhaps the worst part. He'd convinced himself that other children were bad influences, that their parents were weak and permissive. Playdates became a thing of the past. After-school activities were forbidden unless they served what he called strategic personal development goals. I spent my afternoons alone in my room, studying or reading military history books he'd selected for me, books filled with strategies and battles, and the kind of discipline he worshipped. Sometimes, I'd find myself staring out my bedroom window at the neighbor kids playing in their yard, their laughter drifting through the glass like music from another world. I'd press my face against the cool window and imagine what it would be like to run outside and join them, to feel grass beneath my feet instead of the measured steps of another drill, to laugh without worrying about whether the sound was too loud or inappropriate. But then I'd hear his footsteps in the hallway, that distinctive military march that had replaced the casual gait of the father I remembered. And I'd snap back to attention, grab whatever book I was supposed to be reading, and pretend that I hadn't been dreaming of a different life. By the time I turned 9, I had learned to read his moods like weather patterns, understanding which version of him I'd encounter each day. There was the cold, calculating version who spoke only in clipped commands and measured my worth in completed tasks. There was the explosively angry version who appeared when I failed to meet his impossible standards, his voice rising to a roar that made the windows seem to shake. And then, rarely, there was the ghost of my real father, the one who would sometimes look at me with such profound sadness that I'd catch my breath, hoping for a moment of tenderness that never came. The inspection rituals became daily occurrences. Every morning, he'd examine my room with the thoroughness of a commanding officer, running his finger along surfaces checking for dust, measuring the distance between items on my desk with a ruler, ensuring my clothes were folded according to regulations he'd posted on my wall. A single wrinkle in my bedsheets would result in having to remake the bed 5 times. A textbook placed an inch off its designated mark meant losing breakfast and starting the day hungry. Attention to detail separates the successful from the failures, he'd say, his voice devoid of warmth as he noted each imperfection in a small notebook he carried. In the real world, Sarah, nobody will coddle you. Nobody will accept excuses, but I was 9 years old. I shouldn't have needed to know about the real world yet. I should have been worrying about whether I'd picked the right book for show and tell, not whether my sock drawer met military standards. I should have been learning to ride a bike, not learning to stand at attention for hours without moving while he lectured me about responsibility and mental toughness. The worst part was how he'd twisted every normal childhood experience into a test of character. When I cried, and 9-year-olds cry, it's what they do. He'd make me stand facing the wall until I could compose myself like a mature individual. Tears were weakness. Laughter was frivolity. Questions were challenges. To his authority, every natural impulse I had as a child was something to be trained out of me, something that needed to be disciplined away. I started having nightmares around this time, dreams where I was running through an endless obstacle course while his voice echoed around me, counting down time I didn't have, demanding performance I couldn't give. I'd wake up in cold sweats, my heart pounding, only to realize that in a few hours I'd have to get up and face the real obstacle course of daily life under his command. School became increasingly difficult to navigate. While other kids were developing friendships and learning social skills, I was learning to suppress every spontaneous thought, every emotional response. Teachers began to notice that I was different, too quiet, too rigid, too afraid to make mistakes. Mrs. Henderson, my 3rd grade teacher, pulled me aside one day and asked if everything was okay at home. I wanted to tell her. The words were right there, pressing against my teeth, begging to be released. I wanted to explain about the daily inspections, the physical training that left me exhausted, the way I wasn't allowed to be a child anymore. But his voice was in my head, reminding me that family business stayed in the family, that discussing our home life with outsiders was a betrayal that would result in consequences I couldn't imagine. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Henderson," I heard myself say, my voice steady and emotionless in a way that probably convinced her more than any tears would have. "My father is just teaching me discipline." She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her eyes that I now recognize as concern, maybe even fear. But she didn't push further, and I walked back to my desk, carrying the weight of another missed opportunity. Another moment when I could have reached out for help but chose silence instead. The physical training intensified as I got older. What had started as basic exercises evolved into complex routines that would have challenged teenagers. He installed a pull-up bar in my doorway and expected me to complete a certain number every time I entered or left my room. He created obstacle courses in our backyard using military surplus equipment he'd ordered online. Our basement became a makeshift gym where I'd spend hours after school, working through exercises while he critiqued my form and pushed me beyond what my small body could reasonably handle. "Physical fitness is the foundation of mental toughness," he had explained as. I struggled through sets of exercises that left me shaking with exhaustion. Every military leader throughout history understood this principle. Weakness in the body creates weakness in the mind. I began to develop a strange relationship with pain. It became familiar, expected, almost comforting in its predictability. I knew that if I pushed through the burning in my muscles, if I completed the impossible number of repetitions he demanded, I might earn a brief nod of approval, maybe even avoid criticism for the rest of the day. Pain became the price of peace, and I learned to pay it willingly. But the psychological training was worse than anything physical. He'd developed a system of what he called mental conditioning that involved breaking down everything I thought I knew about myself and rebuilding it according to his specifications. He'd point out my weaknesses obsessively, listing them like items in an inventory: too emotional, too soft, too dependent, too weak-willed. Then he'd design exercises specifically to address each weakness, systematically dismantling my sense of self until I began to see myself only through his critical eyes. I stopped recognizing the girl in the mirror. She stood too straight, moved too carefully, spoke too little. Her eyes had lost the brightness I remembered from old photographs, replaced by a wariness that seemed too old for her face. She was becoming exactly what he wanted: disciplined, controlled, unbreakable, but in the process she was disappearing entirely. The summer I turned 10 marked a turning point that I didn't recognize at the time. With no school to provide even temporary respite, he announced that we'd be implementing what he called intensive training protocols. I would wake at 0430 hours instead of 0500. My physical training sessions would double in length. I'd spend afternoons studying military strategy and history instead of playing or reading for pleasure. Even my meals became part of the regimen: timed, portioned, consumed. While he lectured me about nutrition and its impact on performance. "Summer vacation is a luxury civilians can afford," he told me as he outlined the schedule that would govern my next 3 months. "But we're not civilians, Sarah. We're building something stronger, something that will serve you for the rest of your life." I remember staring at the detailed schedule he'd typed and laminated, wondering what had happened to summer vacations filled with bicycle rides and ice cream trucks and lazy afternoons reading in the shade. Those seemed like memories from someone else's life, glimpses of a childhood that belonged to a different girl entirely. The isolation became more complete during those summer months. While neighborhood kids played outside my window, their voices carrying through the humid air like echoes from another world, I moved through my regimented days like a small soldier in training. He'd positioned my desk so that I couldn't see. Outside while studying, explaining that external distractions weakened focus and discipline. I learned to tune out the sounds of normal childhood happiness, to focus only on the task at hand, whether it was completing mathematical equations under time pressure or memorizing passages from military leadership manuals, but something else was happening too, something I didn't have words for at 10 years old. I was beginning to split into two people. There was the Sarah who existed in his world, controlled, disciplined, focused, and there was another Sarah, hidden deep inside, who still remembered what it felt like to laugh without permission, to run without purpose, to simply exist without constant evaluation and judgment. This hidden Sarah grew smaller and quieter each day, but she never disappeared entirely. The breaking point came in late July. I'd been struggling with a particularly difficult section of a military history book he'd assigned, something about tactical formations during the Civil War. The concepts were too advanced for a 10-year-old, but he insisted that intellectual challenges built character just as much as physical ones. After reading the same paragraph 15 times without comprehension, I made the mistake of saying I was confused. His reaction was swift and calculated. "Confusion is a choice, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying that dangerously calm tone that I'd learned to fear more than his shouting. "It's a mental weakness that we're going to address immediately." He made me stand at attention in the center of the living room while he paced around me, listing every instance over the past week when I'd shown what he called intellectual softness. Each item on his list felt like a physical blow. I'd asked for help with a math problem, weakness. I'd taken too long to understand instructions for an exercise routine, laziness. I'd forgotten the name of a Civil War general, lack of mental discipline. "You're going to stand there until you understand that confusion is not acceptable," he said, settling into his chair with the book I'd been struggling with. "When you're ready to demonstrate real intellectual effort, you can try again." I stood there for 4 hours. My legs began to shake after the first hour, but I'd learned not to move when he demanded stillness. My back ached, my neck grew stiff, but I remained at attention while he occasionally glanced up from his reading to assess my posture. The sunlight moved across the room as the afternoon progressed, and I watched the shadows change while my body screamed for relief I knew wouldn't come until I met his impossible standards. When he finally allowed me to attempt the reading again, the words blurred together on the page. My mind felt foggy from standing motionless for so long, and the complex military concepts seemed even more incomprehensible than before. But I forced myself to focus, to push through the exhaustion and confusion, because I knew that failure would mean starting over, standing at attention for another 4 hours while he waited for me to demonstrate the discipline he demanded. Night, lying in bed with my body aching and my mind reeling, I made a discovery that would sustain me through the years ahead. While my external self had learned to comply with his demands, my internal self could remain free. I could stand at attention while my mind wandered to places he couldn't control. I could recite military strategies while secretly composing stories about brave children who escaped from impossible situations. I could maintain perfect posture while dreaming of running through fields where no one timed my steps or criticized my form. This internal rebellion became my survival mechanism. I developed an elaborate fantasy world where children were allowed to be children, where fathers were gentle and loving, where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than character flaws. I populated this world with friends I couldn't have in real life, adventures that would have been forbidden, moments of pure joy that existed only in my imagination. But even this small freedom came with risks. Sometimes I'd find myself smiling at a particularly pleasant fantasy, and his sharp voice would cut through my reverie like a blade. "What are you thinking about, Sarah?" He'd ask, and I'd have to scramble to provide an acceptable answer, something related to whatever task I was supposed to be focused on. I learned to keep my face expressionless, to maintain the same neutral expression whether I was studying military tactics or imagining myself flying through clouds. My fantasy life had to remain completely hidden, protected behind the same disciplined exterior that he'd worked so hard to create. In a strange way, his training in emotional control became the very thing that allowed me to preserve some small part of myself that remained untouched by his methods. The physical effects of this lifestyle were becoming more apparent. I was small for my age, my growth stunted by the stress and the rigid control he maintained over every aspect of my existence. My teachers had mentioned concerns about my weight and development, but he dismissed these as signs of weakness in the educational system, evidence that modern society had become too soft to recognize real strength when it saw it. By 11, I had perfected the art of invisible existence. I moved through our house like a shadow, anticipating his needs before he voiced them, completing tasks to his exact specifications without requiring instruction or correction. To an outside observer, I might have appeared to be the model child, obedient, focused, remarkably mature for my age. But inside, I was disappearing piece by piece, each act of compliance taking something essential away from who I might have been. The military precision that governed our daily life had expanded to cover every conceivable aspect of human behavior. He'd developed detailed protocols for how I should sit, walk, speak, even breathe. My posture had to remain perfect whether I was eating breakfast or completing homework. My responses to his questions had to be immediate and precisely worded. Even my sleep was regulated. I had to lie on my back with my arms at my sides, maintaining military bearing even in unconsciousness. Excellence is not a skill, it's an attitude. He'd remind me during our morning inspections, his critical eye scanning for any deviation from his standards. Everything you do reflects your character, Sarah. There are no small actions, only small people who think actions don't matter. The psychological pressure was relentless. He'd begun implementing what he called stress testing deliberately, creating situations designed to evaluate my responses under pressure. He might suddenly change my schedule without warning, demanding that I adapt immediately while maintaining perfect composure. He'd set impossible deadlines for completing tasks, then criticize my time management when I failed to meet them. He'd ask me complex questions about subjects I'd never studied, then express disappointment when I couldn't provide expert-level answers. These tests felt like psychological warfare, designed to keep me constantly off balance and uncertain. I never knew when a normal day would suddenly transform into an evaluation of my character, when a simple request would become a test of my discipline and mental toughness. The unpredictability was perhaps worse than the consistent demands, because it meant I could never truly relax, never feel safe from judgment and criticism. School had become increasingly difficult to navigate. While my academic performance remained strong, failure wasn't an option in our house. My social skills were deteriorating. I'd become so accustomed to rigid control and constant evaluation that normal childhood interactions felt foreign and dangerous. When classmates invited him to join their games, I'd analyze their requests for hidden tests or trick questions. When teachers praised my work, I'd scan their faces for signs of disappointment or criticism I might have missed. Mrs. Patterson, my fifth grade teacher, scheduled a parent conference that fall. I remember the terror I felt when she mentioned it, knowing that any discussion of my behavior or performance would be dissected and analyzed at home. He attended the meeting with his usual military bearing, wearing his dress uniform despite being retired, presenting himself as the model parent who was raising a disciplined, successful child. I sat between them during the conference, my spine straight and hands folded. While they discussed me as if I weren't there, Mrs. Patterson mentioned concerns about my social development. noting that I seemed isolated from my peers and unusually rigid in my interactions with others. She suggested that I might benefit from more opportunities for unstructured play and creative expression. His response was measured and dismissive. Sarah is being prepared for leadership roles that require discipline and focus, he explained, his voice carrying the authority of his military background. The social skills you're concerned about are actually signs of maturity and self-control. I'd rather have a daughter who can handle responsibility than one who wastes time on frivolous activities. Mrs. Patterson looked at me then, and I saw the same expression I'd noticed in Mrs. Henderson's eyes years earlier, concern mixed with uncertainty about how far she could push. "Sarah," she said gently, "how do you feel about spending time with other children your age?" I felt his presence beside me like a physical weight, felt the expectation of a perfect response that would reflect well on his parenting methods. Words I wanted to say, that I missed playing, that I was lonely, that I wished I could be a normal kid, died in my throat before they could form. "I prefer focusing on my studies and personal development," I heard myself say, the response, automatic and empty. Social activities can be distracting from more important goals. The satisfaction in his posture was palpable, and I knew I'd given him exactly what he wanted. Mrs. Patterson made a few more gentle attempts to engage me in honest conversation, but I'd learned too well that honesty was dangerous, that authentic responses could be used against me later. I maintained my composed exterior while inside. That hidden part of me screamed with frustration and longing for someone to see through the performance. After the conference, he was unusually pleased with my behavior. "You handled that perfectly, Sarah," he said as we drove home. "That teacher doesn't understand what real preparation for life looks like. She wants to keep children soft and dependent. But you showed her that discipline creates strength." But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow, like I traded away pieces of my soul for his approval. Each perfectly controlled response, each demonstration of the discipline he'd instilled in me, felt like another step away from whoever I might have been if I'd been allowed to grow naturally. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and tried to remember what I'd been like before all this started. I could barely recall the girl who used to sing in the bathtub, who'd ask endless questions about everything she saw, who'd believe that her father was the strongest, kindest man in the world. That girl felt like a character from a story I'd read long ago, someone I'd known briefly but could no longer fully remember. The hidden Sarah inside me had grown stronger during these years, even as my external self became more perfectly controlled. She'd learned to exist entirely in secret, in the spaces between his demands and expectations. She lived in stolen moments when I could let my mind wander during the endless hours of studying, in brief seconds when I caught glimpses of other children playing and allowed myself to imagine joining them, in the quiet minutes before sleep when I could remember my mother's voice singing lullabies that he'd forbidden as unnecessary softness. The summer before 7th grade brought changes that even he couldn't control entirely. My body was beginning to develop in ways that complicated his rigid control systems, and I could sense his frustration as he tried to adapt his methods to address what he saw as new weaknesses requiring discipline. Adolescence, in his worldview, was simply another enemy to be defeated through proper training and unwavering commitment to his principles. He'd researched extensively, reading military manuals about managing personnel through difficult transitions, studying child psychology texts that he interpreted through his unique lens of discipline and control. The result was an intensification of everything I'd already endured, combined with new forms of monitoring and evaluation that left me feeling like a specimen under constant observation. My physical training evolved to include what he called advanced conditioning. The exercises became more complex, Incorporating equipment he continued collecting from military surplus stores. Our basement now resembled a professional training facility, complete with weights, resistance equipment, and timing. Devices that measured every aspect of my performance with scientific precision. Your body is changing, Sarah, but that doesn't mean your standards can decline. He explained as he demonstrated new exercise routines that would have challenged adult athletes. This is when discipline becomes most important. Your peers will use these changes as excuses for weakness and loss of focus. You'll use them as opportunities to prove your mental toughness. But my body wasn't cooperating with his theories about mental toughness. I was exhausted constantly, my energy depleted by the combination of physical demands and psychological pressure that never ceased. I'd begun experiencing what I now understand were panic attacks, moments when my heart would race uncontrollably, when I'd feel like I couldn't breathe, when the walls of our house seemed to be closing in around me. He interpreted these episodes as character, flaws requiring additional discipline. When I'd struggle to catch my breath during particularly intense training sessions, he'd make me repeat the exercises until I could complete them without showing distress. When my hands would shake from exhaustion or stress, he'd have me practice, holding objects steady until the trembling stopped through sheer force of will. Fear is a choice, Sarah, he'd say as I fought to control my body's involuntary responses to chronic stress. Weakness is a habit that must be broken through consistent effort. Your mother never learned this lesson, and look what happened to her. The mention of my mother hit like a physical blow. He'd rarely spoken of her since those first months after her death, but now he began using her memory as a weapon against me, suggesting that any sign of emotional vulnerability was evidence that I was following her path toward failure and weakness. The mother I remembered as gentle and loving became, in his revised narrative, an example of everything I needed to avoid becoming. School offered increasingly little refuge as his influence extended even there. He'd begun volunteering for various committees and organizations, positioning himself as an expert on child development and educational standards. Teachers knew him as the decorated veteran who was raising an exceptionally disciplined daughter, and his reputation colored their interactions with me in ways that made honest communication even more impossible. When I struggled with algebra, that fall, my teacher suggested I might benefit from tutoring or additional support. Instead of seeing this as normal academic assistance, he viewed it as evidence of intellectual weakness that required immediate correction. He designed a mathematics training program that involved hours of additional study each night, timed problem solving, sessions that pushed me beyond exhaustion, and elaborate systems of rewards and punishments based on my performance. Excellence is not negotiable, Sarah, he reminded me during one of many late-night study sessions when I was barely able to focus on the numbers swimming before my eyes. Your teacher doesn't understand that struggle builds character. She wants to coddle you, to make learning easy. But easy learning creates weak minds. I began having dreams about mathematics, nightmares where numbers chased me through endless corridors while his voice counted down time that was always running out. I'd wake up exhausted, my sheets soaked with sweat, only to face another day of the same relentless pressure to perform at levels that seemed designed to ensure failure. The social isolation that had always been part of his system became even more pronounced during middle school, when peer relationships typically become crucial for normal development. While my classmates were navigating the complex world of friendships, crushes, and social hierarchies, I remained locked in his system of individual excellence and character development. He developed elaborate theories about peer influence and social corruption, viewing every potential friendship as a threat to the discipline he'd worked so hard to instill. When classmates called our house, he'd answer with formal politeness while making it clear that I wasn't available for social activities. When school events required parental permission, he'd evaluate each opportunity based on its potential contribution to my development, rejecting anything that seemed purely social or recreational. Leadership requires the ability to stand apart from the crowd, Sarah. He'd explain when I'd express disappointment about missing yet another normal childhood experience. History's greatest leaders were often lonely because they understood that excellence demands sacrifice. You're learning lessons about independence and self-reliance that your peers won't understand until it's too late. But I wasn't learning independence. I was learning complete dependence on his approval, total reliance on his systems and structures for defining my worth and purpose. Without his constant evaluation and direction, I felt lost and uncertain, unable to make even simple decisions without considering how they might be judged against his impossible standards. The hidden Sarah inside me had grown more sophisticated. During these years, developing complex inner worlds that provided escape from the relentless control that governed my external existence. I created elaborate fantasy scenarios where children were valued for their kindness rather than their discipline, where fathers were protectors rather than drill sergeants, where mistakes were opportunities for gentle guidance rather than evidence of character defects requiring correction. These inner worlds became so vivid and detailed that sometimes I'd lose track of which reality I was inhabiting. I'd catch myself smiling at an imaginary conversation with a friend who existed only in my mind, or feeling genuine happiness about fictional adventures that provided relief from the gray monotony of regulated existence. 8th grade marked the beginning of what I now recognize as my psychological breaking point, though at the time it felt like just another escalation in a system that had been slowly crushing me for years. He'd decided that my approaching transition to high school required what he called advanced leadership preparation, which translated into even more intensive training designed to eliminate what he perceived as remaining weaknesses in my character development. The daily schedule had become so regimented that every minute of my existence was accounted for and evaluated. I woke to his whistle at precisely 0430 hours, completed an hour of physical training that would have challenged professional athletes, showered and dressed according to his precise specifications, consumed a regulated breakfast while he lectured me about the day's objectives, then walked to school with the bearing and posture of a soldier reporting for duty. After school, there was no transition period, no time to decompress or simply exist without purpose. I returned home to find detailed lists of tasks waiting for me, academic assignments that went far beyond anything my teachers required, physical exercises designed to push my endurance beyond reasonable limits, and what he called character development activities that involved analyzing my own behavior for signs of weakness or mental softness that required correction. The character analysis sessions had become particularly brutal. He'd make me sit at our kitchen table while he questioned me about my thoughts, feelings, and reactions throughout the day. Any sign of normal adolescent emotion, frustration with a difficult assignment, disappointment about missing a social activity, even excitement about a good grade, was dissected and examined for evidence of character flaws that needed to be addressed through additional discipline. Emotional reactions are symptoms of weak mental discipline, he'd explain as he made notes in the ever-present notebook where he tracked my progress and setbacks. Strong leaders don't allow circumstances to dictate their internal state. They maintain consistent focus regardless of external pressures or temporary pleasures. I learned to report my days in the flat, emotionless tone he preferred, describing events without revealing any genuine reactions or feelings that might trigger his intervention. I became expert at presenting a sanitized version of my experiences that would satisfy his requirements while protecting whatever remained of my authentic self from his relentless analysis and correction. That the strain of maintaining this performance was becoming impossible to sustain. I'd begun experiencing what I now understand were dissociative episodes, moments when I'd feel disconnected from my own body and experiences, as if I were watching someone else live my life from a great distance. During particularly intense training sessions or character analysis discussions, I'd find myself floating somewhere near the ceiling, observing the girl below who moved and spoke according to his demands, while the real me remained safely hidden and untouchable. These episodes frightened me because they represented a loss of control that he would have seen as ultimate weakness, evidence that all his years of training had failed to create the mental toughness he'd been working toward. I learned to hide them completely, to maintain perfect external composure, even when my mind was fragmenting under the pressure of trying to be someone I wasn't, while simultaneously protecting who I actually was. The physical effects of chronic stress were becoming harder to disguise. I'd lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, my growth stunted by years of inadequate nutrition and excessive physical demands. I had dark circles under my eyes from sleep that was never restorative because even unconsciousness was regulated and monitored. My hands developed a slight tremor that appeared during times of particular stress, something I'd learned to hide by keeping them clasped behind my back or folded in my lap at school. Teachers began expressing more direct concerns about my appearance and behavior. Mrs. Rodriguez, my English teacher, asked me to stay after class one afternoon in late fall. I sat in the empty classroom while she struggled to find words for observations that probably seemed as troubling to her as they were dangerous. To me, "Sarah, I've noticed that you seem very tired lately," she began carefully, her voice carrying the same gentle concern I'd learned to fear from well-meaning adults who couldn't understand that their questions put me in impossible positions. "Are you getting enough sleep at home?" The question hung in the air between us like a trap waiting to spring. I knew that any honest answer would lead to more questions, potentially involving school counselors or administrators, and ultimately reaching him with consequences I couldn't predict or control. But I also sensed that Mrs. Rodriguez genuinely cared about my well-being, and part of me desperately wanted to trust someone with the truth I'd been carrying alone for so many years. "I sleep fine, Mrs. Rodriguez," I heard myself say, the lie flowing smoothly from years of practice. "I've just been working hard on some personal development projects my father has designed for me. He's helping me prepare for high school and beyond." She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see her internal struggle between professional concern and respect for family privacy. "Sarah, you know that if you ever need someone to talk to, someone outside your family, I'm here. Sometimes it helps to have a different perspective on things." The offer hung between us like a lifeline I was too afraid to grab. I wanted to tell her about the daily inspections, the impossible standards, the way I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be a child without constant evaluation and criticism. But his voice was in my head, reminding me that family loyalty was sacred, that discussing our private methods with outsiders was a betrayal that would destroy everything he'd worked to build. "Thank you, Mrs. Rodriguez, but everything is really fine at home," I said, maintaining the calm, controlled tone. That had become my default response to adult concern. My father is a veteran, so he has high standards, but that's helping me become stronger and more disciplined. I saw the moment when she decided not to push further, when professional caution overcame personal instinct. She nodded slowly and dismissed me with instructions to take care of myself, words that felt both caring and helplessly inadequate given the reality of my situation. That evening, I sat through another character analysis session where he questioned me about my interactions with teachers, my academic performance, and my adherence to the principles he'd spent years instilling. I reported my conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez in the neutral, factual tone he preferred, presenting it as evidence of my successful maintenance of family privacy rather than a missed opportunity for intervention. "Excellent work, Sarah," he said, making approving notes in his ever-present record book. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of loyalty and discretion that separates leaders from followers. Mrs. Rodriguez means well, but she doesn't understand that real strength comes from internal discipline, not external validation or support." His praise felt hollow and poisonous, recognition for my successful participation in my own isolation and abuse. But I'd learned to accept his approval as necessary fuel for survival, even when it came at the cost of opportunities that might have led to help or rescue. The winter of 8th grade brought an unexpected disruption to our carefully regulated world when he was hospitalized for emergency surgery following a heart attack that struck him during one of our morning training sessions. I found him collapsed in our basement gym, his face gray and his breathing labored. The military precision that had governed our lives for so many years suddenly reduced to human vulnerability and fear. For the first time in memory, I had to make decisions without his guidance or approval. I called 911, rode in the ambulance to the hospital, sat in sterile waiting rooms while doctors worked to save the man who had systematically destroyed my childhood while believing he was building my character. The irony wasn't lost on me that his obsession with physical fitness and mental toughness had been undermined by the very stress he'd used as a tool for my development. During the 3 days he spent in intensive care, I experienced something I'd almost forgotten existed. Silence. Not the regulated quiet he demanded during study periods or the tense stillness that preceded his evaluations, but actual peaceful silence where I could think my own thoughts without fear of judgment or correction. I sat in our empty house and tried to remember what it felt like to exist without constant surveillance and criticism. The neighbors, Mrs. Chun and her teenage daughter Lisa, brought food and offered support during those strange, suspended days when my normal routine had been shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Mrs. Chun had always been kind but distant, respecting what she assumed was our family's preference for privacy. Now, with him hospitalized and me obviously struggling to manage alone, she stepped in with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. "You don't have to handle everything by yourself, Sarah," she said as she helped me organize meals and manage the basic household tasks that had always been rigidly structured by his systems. "It's okay to accept help when you need it." The concept of accepting help felt foreign and dangerous. I'd been trained to view dependence on others as weakness, to see my ability to handle challenges alone as evidence of the strength he had worked to develop. But sitting in Mrs. Chun's warm kitchen, eating homemade soup while Lisa chatted about normal teenage concerns, I caught a glimpse of what family life could look like when it wasn't organized around discipline and character development. Lisa was 15, just 2 years older than me, but she seemed to inhabit a completely different world. She talked about friends and school activities, complained good-naturedly about her parents' expectations, and expressed opinions about everything from music to politics with the casual confidence of someone who'd never been trained to suppress authentic thoughts and feelings. Watching her interact with her mother, teasing, arguing, showing affection without fear of criticism, was like observing creatures from another species. "You're so quiet, Sarah," Lisa observed during one of our conversations while her mother was at work. "I mean, I know you're going through a lot with your dad in the hospital, but you've always been really controlled. Don't you ever just want to scream or cry or do something totally impulsive?" The question struck me like a physical blow because the answer was yes. I did want to scream and cry and act impulsively, but I'd been trained so thoroughly to suppress those impulses that I'd almost forgotten they existed. The hidden Sarah inside me had been screaming for years, but I'd become so skilled at containing her that even I could barely hear her voice anymore. "I guess I'm just naturally disciplined," I heard myself say, falling back on the explanation that had served me for so many years. My father has taught me that emotional control is important for success. Lisa looked at me with something that might have been pity or concern, though she was too young to fully understand what she was observing. That sounds really hard, she said simply. I don't think I could live like that. Her words stayed with me as I returned to our empty house each evening, where the silence continued to reveal things about my life that had been hidden by years of constant activity and evaluation. Without his presence demanding immediate responses and perfect performance, I began to notice how much tension I carried in my body, how exhausted I felt when I wasn't pushing through fatigue to meet his standards, how foreign it felt to make simple choices about what to eat or when to sleep without considering his approval. On the third night, alone in my room, without the usual evening inspection and character analysis session, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cried. Not the controlled tears that sometimes escaped during particularly difficult training sessions, but deep, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere I'd forgotten existed. I cried for the childhood I'd lost, for the normal experiences I'd been denied, for the girl I might have been if circumstances had been different. But even in that moment of release, I was terrified that somehow he'd know, that my breakdown would be detected and used as evidence of weakness requiring additional correction when he returned. I muffled my sobs in my pillow and forced myself to stop before the tears could leave visible evidence of my emotional failure. When he was discharged from the hospital, he returned home with new medication and doctor's orders for reduced stress and moderate activity. But rather than accepting these limitations, he viewed his heart attack as another challenge to be overcome through proper discipline and mental toughness. Within days, he had adapted his systems to accommodate his physical restrictions while maintaining the same psychological pressure that had always characterized our relationship. This setback is actually an opportunity, Sarah, he explained as he redesigned our daily routines to work around his new limitations. It's a chance for you to demonstrate increased independence and leadership while I focus on recovery. You'll be taking on additional responsibilities that will accelerate your character development. The additional responsibilities meant managing more of the household tasks while maintaining all my previous obligations, physical training, academic work, and character analysis sessions. I became responsible for meal planning and preparation according to his nutritional standards, for maintaining the house according to his inspection criteria, for tracking my own progress and reporting any failures or weaknesses that required his attention. High school arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for years, bringing with it new challenges that even his comprehensive preparation systems couldn't fully address. The transition from the controlled environment of middle school to the complex social and academic landscape of West Valley High exposed gaps in my development that became increasingly difficult to hide. Even for myself, he'd spent months developing what he called my high school success protocol, a detailed plan that covered everything from course selection to time management to strategies for maintaining focus amid the increased distractions and social pressures I'd encounter. But no amount of planning could prepare me for the reality of navigating an environment where normal teenagers were learning independence while I remained locked in a system of external control that had become my entire identity. My academic performance was exceptional, as always. Failure had never been an option in our house, but my social isolation became more pronounced as my classmates developed the kind of peer relationships that were fundamental to normal adolescent development. While they formed study groups, attended school events, and began exploring romantic relationships, one remained focused on maintaining the standards he'd established, completing assignments with military precision while avoiding the social connections he viewed as potential threats to my discipline. The guidance counselor, Mr. Williams, called me into his office during the second week of school. He was a kind man in his 50s who'd spent decades helping teenagers navigate the challenges of academic and personal development, and he'd obviously noticed something about my behavior that concerned him. "Sarah, I've been reviewing your academic records, and your performance is truly outstanding," he began, settling back in his chair with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations with adolescents. "But I'm also noticing that you haven't signed up for any extracurricular activities, and several of your teachers have mentioned that you seem very isolated from your peers." I sat across from him with perfect posture, my hands folded in my lap, prepared to deliver the explanations I'd been practicing since elementary school. "I prefer to focus on my academic work, Mr. Williams. My father has taught me that excellence requires sacrifice, and social activities can be distracting from more important goals." He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "Sarah, part of high school is learning to balance different aspects of development: academic, social, emotional. Students who only focus on grades often struggle later when they need skills that come from interacting with peers, from learning to work in groups, from discovering their own interests and passions." The word passions struck me strangely because I couldn't remember the last time I thought about what I actually wanted to do or learn or become. My interests had been so thoroughly shaped by his priorities that I'd lost track of any authentic preferences or curiosities I might have had. When Mr. Williams asked about my hobbies or activities I enjoyed outside of schoolwork, I found myself struggling to provide answers that weren't simply reflections of his training programs. "I enjoy physical fitness and military history," I said, falling back on topics that would sound appropriately focused and mature. "My father is a veteran, so he's taught me to appreciate the importance of discipline and strategic thinking." Mr. Williams nodded thoughtfully, but I could see him trying to read between the lines of my carefully constructed responses. "Those are valuable interests, Sarah, but I'm wondering about things that are purely yours, activities you choose because they bring you joy or satisfy your curiosity, not because they serve a larger developmental purpose." The question exposed something I've been trying not to acknowledge, even to myself. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something purely for joy. Couldn't recall choosing an activity simply because it interested me rather than because it met his standards for character development. The hidden Sarah inside me stirred restlessly, remembering fragments of childhood interests that had been systematically eliminated as frivolous distractions from more important pursuits. "I don't really have time for activities that don't contribute to my long-term goals," I heard myself say, the response automatic but feeling increasingly hollow as I spoke. "My father has taught me that successful people make choices based on results rather than temporary pleasures." Mr. Williams was quiet for a moment, and I sensed that he was weighing his words carefully. "Sarah, can I ask you something? When you think about your future, what do you see? Not what your father sees for you, but what you actually want for yourself." The question hit me like a physical blow because I realized I didn't have an answer. I'd become so thoroughly trained to pursue excellence according to his definitions that I'd never developed any vision of my own future, any dreams or goals that originated from my authentic interests and desires. I was 15 years old and had no idea what I actually wanted from life beyond meeting his standards and avoiding his criticism. "I want to be successful," I said weakly, aware that the answer revealed more about my emptiness than my ambitions. "I want to make good use of the discipline and training I've received." He scheduled follow-up meetings, expressing concern about what he diplomatically called my narrow focus and suggesting that I consider joining at least one activity that would help me develop different aspects of my personality. But I knew that any significant change in my routine would require his approval. And he'd already made his position clear about extracurricular activities that didn't directly contribute to measurable achievement. That evening, I sat through another character analysis session where I reported my conversation with Mr. Williams in the neutral, factual tone he preferred. I presented the guidance counselor's concerns as evidence of the educational system's failure to understand real preparation for success, turning his questions into validation of our family's approach to my development. Mr. Williams represents everything that's wrong with modern education, he said, making disapproving notes about the school's attempt to interfere with his methods. He wants to distract you with social activities and recreational pursuits that will weaken your focus and dilute your competitive advantage. You handled the situation perfectly by maintaining your commitment to excellence over popularity. But even as I accepted his praise, something inside me was shifting. The questions Mr. Williams had asked were working like seeds planted in soil that had been hardened by years of rigid control. For the first time, I was beginning to wonder what my life might look like if I had choices, if I could pursue interests that came from my own curiosity rather than his strategic planning. The crack in my carefully constructed facade began during sophomore year when I was assigned to work on a group project for American history with 3 classmates I barely knew. For the first time in memory, I was forced to collaborate with peers in a setting that couldn't be controlled or regulated by his systems, and the experience revealed how fundamentally different my upbringing had been from that of normal teenagers. Jessica, Marcus, and David were typical 15-year-olds, quick to laugh, comfortable expressing disagreement, casual in their interactions with authority figures. Watching them work together was like observing a foreign culture, one where mistakes were met with good-natured teasing rather than harsh criticism, where creative ideas were encouraged rather than evaluated for their strategic value, where the process of learning was allowed to be messy and collaborative rather than rigidly structured and individually focused. "Sarah, you're like a machine," Jessica observed after our second group meeting, her tone carrying admiration mixed with concern. "You have all these facts memorized and you write everything down perfectly, but you never seem to have fun with any of it. Don't you ever just get excited about learning something cool?" Her question echoed Mr. Williams' inquiry about joy and passion, concepts that felt increasingly foreign as I tried to navigate relationships that weren't based on performance and evaluation. I'd been trained to view learning as work, as evidence of discipline and character development, not as something that could be inherently enjoyable or personally meaningful. "I like to be thorough," I said, falling back on explanations that had always satisfied adults who mistook my rigid approach for maturity. My father taught me that excellence requires attention to detail and consistent effort. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with my standard response. "Dude, that sounds exhausting," he said with the casual honesty that characterized teenage interactions. "Like, yeah, you get amazing grades, but when do you get to just be a person? When do you do stuff just because you want to, not because someone told you it was important?" His question haunted me for days because I couldn't answer it honestly, without revealing how completely my identity had been shaped by external expectations rather than internal desires. I couldn't tell them about the daily inspections, the character analysis sessions, the way every aspect of my existence was evaluated and corrected according to standards I'd never chosen for myself. Working with the group also exposed me to different family dynamics that challenge everything I've been taught about proper parenting and child development. When we met at Jessica's house, I watched her mother bring us snacks and ask about our project with genuine interest rather than evaluation. She offered suggestions without criticism, praised our progress without analyzing it for signs of character weakness, and treated Jessica with affection that wasn't contingent on perfect behavior or exceptional performance. Your mom is really nice, I told Jessica after one particularly warm interaction. Unable to keep the wistfulness from my voice, Jessica shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who'd never doubted parental love. She's okay. Sometimes she's annoying when she worries too much, but mostly she's pretty cool. What's your mom like? The question stopped me cold because I realized I hadn't talked about my mother in years. Hadn't even thought about what my life might have been like if she'd lived. He'd systematically erased her memory from our house and our conversations, presenting himself as the only parent I'd ever needed while transforming her into a cautionary tale about weakness and insufficient discipline. My mother died when I was little, I said quietly, the words feeling strange and heavy in my mouth. It's just me and my father now. The sympathy in their eyes was immediate and genuine, but it was Jessica's next question that nearly broke through. The careful control I'd maintained for so many years. That must be really hard. Is your dad good at taking care of you by himself? I wanted to tell them the truth, that I didn't know what being taken care of felt like, that my father had replaced nurturing with training, love with evaluation, protection with preparation for battles I'd never chosen to fight. But the words wouldn't come, blocked by years of conditioning that made honesty feel like betrayal and vulnerability seem like weakness requiring correction. He's very dedicated to making sure I'm prepared for success, I said instead, the response. Automatic, but feeling increasingly inadequate as I watched their faces register the emptiness of my words. That night, lying in bed after completing my evening exercise routine and character analysis session, I found myself thinking about Jessica's casual relationship with her mother, the way she could express frustration or disagreement without fear of consequences, the way her family seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company rather than existing in a state of constant evaluation and improvement. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine what my life might have been like if my mother had lived. If I'd grown up in a house where mistakes were learning opportunities rather than character defects, where love wasn't contingent on performance, where I'd been allowed to develop interests and relationships based on my own curiosity and affection rather than strategic planning for future success. The fantasy was dangerous because it made the reality of my situation feel even more oppressive and abnormal. I'd spent years believing that his methods, while difficult, were necessary preparation for a competitive world that would crush undisciplined children. But watching my classmates navigate challenges with resilience that came from emotional support rather than rigid training, seeing them maintain optimism and creativity despite normal teenage struggles, I began to question whether his approach was preparing me for success or simply creating a different kind of weakness, the inability to function without external control and validation. The group project was successful by every measure he would have used. We received an excellent grade, demonstrated thorough research and clear presentation skills, met every deadline with professional precision. But the experience had planted seeds of doubt about whether academic achievement was worth the isolation and emotional emptiness that had become my defining characteristics. When I reported our success during that evening's character analysis session, I presented it as validation of the superiority of disciplined individual preparation over collaborative social learning. But privately, I found myself remembering the laughter and creative energy that had emerged from our group discussions, the way ideas had built on each other in ways that individual study couldn't replicate, the sense of belonging and shared purpose that had felt foreign but appealing. You demonstrated excellent leadership in that project, Sarah, he said, making approving notes about my ability to maintain standards while working with less disciplined peers. You showed them what real preparation and focus look like. That's the kind of influence successful people have on those around them. The breaking point came during the spring of my junior year. triggered by an event so seemingly minor that it took me months to understand its significance. I was walking home from school on a particular beautiful May afternoon when I passed the local community center and heard music drifting from an open window. It was piano music, something classical and complex that I didn't recognize, but it stopped me in my tracks because it was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in years. Without conscious decision, I found myself walking toward the building, drawn by the melody that seemed to speak to some part of me that had been silent for so long I'd forgotten it existed. Through the window, I could see a woman about my mother's age playing an old upright piano, her face transformed by the kind of pure joy that I'd been trained to view as frivolous self-indulgence. I stood there for 20 minutes, completely absorbed in music that served no strategic purpose, contributed nothing to my character development, and violated every principle of time management and goal-oriented behavior that had governed my life for nearly a decade. But for those 20 minutes, I felt something I couldn't name, something that made my chest ache with longing for experiences I'd never been allowed to have. When I finally forced myself to continue home, I was late for the first time in years. He was waiting at the door with his stopwatch, his expression shifting from concern to disappointment as he calculated the deviation from my expected arrival time. "You're 8 minutes late, Sarah," he said, making notes in his ever-present record book. "What circumstances prevented you from maintaining your established schedule?" I should have had an excuse ready, should have crafted an explanation that would satisfy his need for accountability, while avoiding discussion of anything he might consider wasteful or undisciplined. But something about the music I'd heard, about the joy on that woman's face, made me unwilling to lie about what had been, for me, a moment of unexpected beauty. I stopped to listen to someone playing piano at the community center. I said, the words feeling both dangerous and liberating as they left my mouth. The music was beautiful, and I lost track of time. His reaction was swift and predictable. Music appreciation that interferes with established schedules demonstrates poor time management and misplaced priorities, he said, his voice carrying the cold disappointment that had become my most feared form of criticism. Recreational activities must be scheduled and limited to prevent them from undermining more important obligations. But instead of the usual shame and immediate commitment to do better, I found myself feeling something I'd never experienced before. In response to his criticism, anger. Not the frustrated anger of a child being denied something she wants, but the righteous anger of someone who was beginning to understand that she'd been denied fundamental aspects of human experience in service of an ideology that valued control over growth, performance over authentic development. Why is appreciating beautiful music a misplaced priority? I asked, the question emerging from that hidden part of me that had been growing stronger despite all his efforts to eliminate it. Why is everything I enjoy automatically considered recreational and unnecessary? The silence that followed my questions was unlike anything I'd experienced in our house. He stared at me with an expression that mixed surprise, disappointment, and something that might have been fear. Fear that his carefully constructed system was being challenged by the very person it was designed to control. "You're questioning fundamental principles that have guided your development for years, Sarah," he said finally, his voice measured but carrying an undercurrent of warning. "This kind of rebellious thinking is exactly why discipline is necessary. Without structure and clear priorities, young people make impulsive decisions that undermine their long-term success." But his explanation, which had satisfied me for so many years, now sounded hollow and defensive. I was beginning to see that his fundamental principles were arbitrary rules designed to maintain his control rather than universal truths about success and character development. The music I'd heard that afternoon had awakened something in me that couldn't be dismissed as rebellious. thinking or undisciplined self-indulgence. What if I want to learn to play piano? I asked, the question emerging from somewhere deep inside me before I could consider its implications. What if I want to experience the kind of joy I saw on that woman's face? His response was immediate and brutal. Joy derived from activities that don't contribute to measurable achievement is a form of self-deception that weak people use to avoid confronting their own limitations. He said, his words designed to cut through whatever rebellion was growing. Inside me, your mother believed in that kind of shallow happiness, and look where it led her. The mention of my mother in that context, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of joy and self-expression, triggered something in me that years of conditioning couldn't suppress. For the first time in my memory, I raised my voice to him, my words charged with emotions I'd been trained to hide. "Don't talk about my mother like that," I said, my voice shaking with anger and grief I'd never been allowed to express. She loved music and laughter and beautiful things, and that didn't make her weak. It made her human. The physical reaction was instantaneous. He demanded that I assume the position for extended attention stance, the punishment that had been used throughout my childhood to address what he called emotional outbursts and insubordination. But instead of complying automatically as I had thousands of times before, I found myself hesitating, questioning whether I had to submit to consequences for expressing authentic feelings about my own mother. "Sarah, you will assume the position." Immediately, he said, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded my obedience for nearly 10 years. This display of emotional volatility requires immediate correction before it becomes a pattern of undisciplined behavior. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, caught between the conditioning that demanded compliance and the growing part of me that recognized his system as fundamentally wrong. The hidden Sarah, who had been developing in secret for so many years, was finally strong enough to challenge the external Sarah, who had been performing obedience and discipline. Slowly, deliberately, I shook my head. "No," I said, the word feeling foreign but powerful as it left my mouth. "I won't stand at attention for wanting to appreciate music or for defending my mother's memory." The shock on his face was complete and devastating. In that moment, I think, he realized that all his years of careful conditioning hadn't eliminated my authentic self. They'd only driven it underground, where it had been growing stronger and more determined to eventually break free. The aftermath of my refusal to comply with his punishment created a crisis in our household that neither of us was prepared to handle. For the first time in nearly a decade, his system of control had been directly challenged by its primary subject, and the foundation of our entire relationship began to crack under the pressure of my emerging resistance. He spent the following days implementing what he called corrective measures designed to address what he viewed as a serious regression. In my character development, my schedule became even more rigorous. My physical training intensified to levels that pushed my body beyond its limits, and the character analysis sessions extended deep into the night as he attempted to identify and eliminate whatever weakness had allowed rebellion to take root in my mind. "This kind of defiance doesn't appear overnight, Sarah," he said during one particularly brutal evaluation session where he dissected every interaction I'd had over the previous months, searching for signs of corrupting influences that might have undermined his training. "Someone or something has been teaching you to question proven methods of development. We need to identify the source and eliminate it." But the source wasn't external. It was the cumulative effect of 17 years of suppressed authentic self finally reaching a critical mass that could no longer be contained by even his most sophisticated control mechanisms. The music I'd heard at the community center had been a catalyst, not a cause, awakening something that had been growing in secret despite all his efforts to eliminate it. Endured his corrective measures with the same stoic discipline he'd trained. into me, but internally I was experiencing a revolution that he couldn't detect or address. Every additional punishment, every intensified training session, every attempt to break down my resistance only strengthened my growing understanding that his methods were designed to serve his needs rather than my development. The physical toll of his escalated training became impossible to ignore. I'd lost more weight I couldn't afford to lose. My hands developed a constant tremor from exhaustion and stress, and I began experiencing chest pains that I recognized as symptoms of the anxiety that had been building for years, but had never been acknowledged or addressed at school. The changes in my behavior and appearance became so pronounced that even teachers who hadn't previously expressed concern began asking questions. I couldn't answer honestly without revealing the true nature of my home life. Mrs. Patterson, who had taught me years earlier and now worked as a substitute teacher, pulled me aside after noticing my deteriorating condition. "Sarah, I've watched you grow up in this school system, and I'm very worried about you," she said, her voice carrying the kind of direct concern that bypassed the polite euphemisms adults usually used when discussing difficult family situations. "You look exhausted and stressed in ways that go beyond normal academic pressure. Are you safe at home?" The question hung in the air between us like a lifeline I was still too afraid to grab. Despite my growing resistance to his methods, years of conditioning made it almost impossible to seek help from outside sources. To admit that the discipline he'd worked so hard to instill was actually a form of abuse that had damaged me in ways I was only beginning to understand. "My father has high standards," I said, falling back on explanations that felt increasingly inadequate even to me. "Sometimes the training is difficult, but it's designed to make me stronger." But Mrs. Patterson had taught hundreds of children over her career, and she recognized signs of distress that went beyond demanding parental expectations. "Sarah, strength doesn't come from being pushed beyond your limits by someone else," she said gently. "Real strength comes from learning to trust your own judgment, to develop your own values, to make choices based on your authentic interests and capabilities." Her words echoed thoughts I'd been having but hadn't been able to articulate, validating feelings I'd been trained to dismiss as weakness or self-indulgence. For the first time, an adult was telling me that my own judgment might be valuable, that my authentic interests mattered, that I had the right to make choices about my own life and development. "I don't know what my authentic interests are," I admitted, the confession feeling both liberating and terrifying. "I've been following his plans for so long that I can't remember what I actually want for myself." She nodded with the understanding of someone who'd witnessed the effects of authoritarian parenting on countless students. "That's not uncommon for young people who've grown up in highly controlled environments," she said. "But you're 17 years old, Sarah. You have the legal right to make some of your own decisions, and you certainly have the right to explore interests that bring you joy rather than just preparing you for some theoretical future success." That evening, I sat through another extended character analysis session where he questioned me about my interactions with teachers, my academic performance, and any signs of the rebellious thinking he was determined to eliminate. But instead of the usual automatic compliance, I found myself studying his face, his methods, his obvious desperation to maintain control over someone who was outgrowing his system. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the strong, wise father figure who was preparing me for success, but as a damaged man who was using his daughter to work out his own issues with control, discipline, and the emotional pain he'd never learned to process in healthy ways. His military training, his obsession with strength and discipline, his systematic elimination of joy and spontaneity from our lives, all of it was serving his psychological needs rather than my developmental ones. "You seem distracted tonight, Sarah," he observed, making notes about what he perceived as decreased focus and attention during our session. "This kind of mental wandering is exactly the weakness we've been working to address." It demonstrates insufficient commitment to personal growth and character development, but his criticism no longer carried the power to shame me into compliance. I was beginning to understand that his definitions of strength and weakness, success and failure, discipline and self-indulgence were not universal truths, but personal preferences that he'd imposed on me through years of systematic conditioning. I was thinking about what I want to study in college, I said, testing the waters of honest communication in a relationship that had been built on performance and evaluation. I've been wondering if I should choose a major based on my own interests, rather than just career prospects and earning potential. His reaction was immediate and predictable. Career prospects and earning potential are the primary considerations for educational investment, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never questioned his own assumptions about success and fulfillment. Personal interests are luxuries that people can pursue after they've established financial security and professional credibility. Your education is too important to be guided by temporary preferences or emotional impulses. But his explanation no longer satisfied me because I was beginning to understand that a life guided entirely by strategic considerations, without room for passion or personal meaning, wasn't actually successful. It was empty. I've been trained to pursue achievement without ever considering whether those achievements would bring satisfaction or fulfillment, to build a life that looked impressive from the outside while remaining hollow at its core. What if financial security isn't worth pursuing if it means spending my life doing work that doesn't matter to me? I asked, the question emerging from thoughts I'd been afraid to voice even to myself. What if there are more important things than career prospects and earning potential? The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of us was ready to address directly. I was challenging not just his educational philosophy, but the entire foundation of the life he'd built. For both of us, questioning whether his years of sacrifice and discipline had been moving us toward goals worth achieving. "You're talking like your mother now," he said finally, his voice carrying a mixture of disappointment and something that might have been grief. She believed in following dreams and pursuing happiness, and it made her weak when life became difficult. "I won't let you make the same mistakes she did." For the first time, I heard the pain in his voice when he mentioned my mother, the fear that losing her had created in him, the way he'd used discipline and control to protect himself and me from the vulnerability that comes with love and loss. But I also recognized that his methods had created a different kind of loss, the loss of joy, spontaneity, and authentic connection that makes life worth living even when it's difficult and uncertain.